welcome to the series of Education Interrupted, as an initiative designed to bring attention to the consequences of the war and conflict on educational opportunities for the next generation. Through a series of interviews, this initiative will highlight how ongoing conflicts deny young people access to education, ultimately disturbing their future and the potential that they have as they navigate an increasingly complex world. Today, I'm very honored to have our speaker here, Andre Maguire, who serves as a Deputy Director of Global Program at the UNICEF in the United States, where he serves as a focal point for education and protection programs. We will cover during this conversation the disruption to education in conflict settings around the globe, including in Haiti, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, and Myanmar. Andrew will also detail some of the ways that UNICEF and its partners and young people work to continue education in emergencies. Great to have you here, Andrew. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me. It's such an important conversation to have, so thanks.
Thank you. So, Andrew, I would like to start by asking you to give us a general sense of the current state of education disruptions that are caused by the conflict.
Sure. Well, if we've been reading the news over the last few years, we've all seen an increasing, escalating number of crises in the world, and those directly threaten children's lives and their fundamental right to education. To give you a global sense, globally, 224 million children are affected by crises and are in need of urgent education support. That includes 127 million children who are in school but not receiving or achieving minimum proficiency in reading or mathematics. So to put that into context for our North Carolina viewers, 224 million children is the equivalent of 20 times the population of North Carolina. So the need is massive. In some of these conflicts have been dominating the headlines, and we might be more familiar with them. In Ukraine, millions of children's education has been disrupted, as many have fled to neighboring countries or sheltered within Ukraine. In the Kharkivska region specifically, children have been unable to attend school for over 900 days, as their schools faced constant shelling. As schools attempted to reopen early in September of this year, many faced continued attacks despite international law declaring that schools are safe spaces that should be protected during conflict. Of course, the conflict in Gaza has also been incredibly harmful to children. Since the conflict began in October 2023, every school in Gaza has been closed, restricting access to education for more than 625,000 students. That includes the class of about 39,000 students who were in their final year of secondary school, who, for the first time ever, couldn't take their final college placement exams or receive their diplomas. Now, while those conflicts in the headlines are incredibly troubling, there are also so many other crises with deeply troubling impacts on education. In Sudan, internal armed conflict has forced 19 million school-age children out of school. In Haiti, over 1 million children face challenges in accessing their education due to civil unrest and gang violence. And in Myanmar, about 4.5 million children have limited or no access to learning as a result of the insecurity that has followed the military's takeover of the government. And unfortunately, this list could go on and on. Fortunately, despite these daunting situations, UNICEF has continued its efforts. And just to give you a sense of this work, in 2023, UNICEF's Education in Emergencies response was able to reach about 17.7 million children around the globe, including providing learning supplies for 5.2 million children in humanitarian settings. So that's just a sense of sort of the global snapshot of this challenge.
Well, I normally would say I don't like to talk about numbers just because it kind of seems like it dehumanizes these conflicts. But I think it's very important to start with those numbers to put in context this understanding of how many children around the world today they don't have access to education. And as you know, we have talked to many experts, and they would normally state that education during conflict just becomes um not a necessarily like a need. And as I remember also when I was doing my high school and displaced in Syria and seeking refuge in Syria, education was not a priority for my parents because stating that we need to survive tonight. So thinking really on just short terms on this survival mode. But talking about these numbers and just reflecting on these numbers, what are the consequences for the disruptions to education on the next generation, really?
Yeah, I appreciate that question because you're right. It can feel hard to grasp when we're talking about this massive scale of a problem, but the individual impacts on a child are manifold. There's obvious immediate consequences of not attending schools. When children aren't able to learn, they fall behind in building foundational skills like numeracy and literacy. They also miss out on building really critical transferable skills like communication, negotiation, teamwork. For adolescents, they're missing out on opportunities to develop vocational and technical skills that might unlock future professional opportunities. And all these skills are really essential in just being able to access other services and engaging in a community and finding professional and personal opportunities. So to wrap that piece up, a lack of education really directly jeopardizes the opportunities that a young person might have in the future. So that piece, those consequences might be a little bit more obvious, but there are actually a number of secondary consequences to these disruptions to education. For instance, when children aren't in school, they face increased vulnerabilities to violations of their own protection. They're more vulnerable to violence in the home because they're spending more time there, or in their communities. When families face economic constraints, they might draft their children into child labor or force them into early marriages. Similarly, not being able to access schools means that children are cut off from critical resources that they can access there. For example, many children receive at least one nutritious meal when they attend school. And for some, those are incredibly needed inputs to their health development that they're missing out on. Attending school also promotes a child's peer relationships and connects them with teachers and other service providers. And all of those relationships are really critical in promoting and protecting a child's well-being and just fostering their overall development. So when an armed conflict disrupts a child's chance to go to school, it's also disrupting the chance for them to gain some of these benefits and, is really creating consequences for them. So, when UNICEF is emphasizing just how critical the right to education is, it's not just about that right to learn, but some of these other elements that make, the opportunity to have education just so powerful.
Great to end on this point, Andrew, because I also have a little bit of kind of like addition to that part is when you're talking that the role of the UNICEF is not only about focusing on education, but all these other elements that makes education possible, right? I can't help but to reflect on my journey as a child in Iraq who had the privilege of attending school at that time during the economic sanctions during the 90s. I still remember the role and the word of the UNICEF that I continuously heard it. And it always brought hope to me when I heard the word the UNICEF because it meant there's some assistance that the children will be getting as the malnutrition was really crawling into those children and as numbers we're talking in the statistics 500,000 child died from the malnutrition. I've heard the word UNICEF. So in the early days and months of the crisis and as we're talking about different places around the world, how does UNICEF address disruptions to education?
Course, it's always really powerful to hear these personal stories about UNICEF's impact. And I'm glad that it holds such a positive place in your memory. And I hope that's true for many people. So yeah, I mean, as these crises emerge, UNICEF is really activating quickly in the early days of an emergency to provide services for children. In complex emergencies, big picture, humanitarian actors are coordinated through what's called a cluster system, and different organizations lead the coordination on distinct areas of work. So UNICEF actually co-leads the education cluster with the global NGO Save the Children. And together, we're able to collaborate with all relevant stakeholders that are activating around a particular humanitarian response to ensure that it's really comprehensive and reflective of the needs that children have. So once we're coordinated, one of the key strategies in the early days of conflict is making sure that there are safe spaces where children and families can access different services. So this might be setting up in informal settlements, in formalized refugee camps, or in key points along migration routes, for example. And in those places, UNICEF is setting up temporary learning spaces or safe spaces for children. So these are really spaces that allow an outlet for children to play, to express themselves through art and music, to enjoy some more non-formal learning opportunities, and also to have space to process some of the traumatic things that they have experienced and that their communities have faced. These informal learning spaces, they're not a comprehensive replacement for formal education. They are not meant to replace a classroom, but they still provide these age-appropriate continuing learning opportunities that can minimize some of the learning losses in the early days of a conflict. So that's really important. These safe spaces are also important because they serve as an access point for other services. So in them, many children can benefit from immediate mental health and psychosocial support services. They can also access primary health care. And in some cases, children might be able to receive essential immunizations that are so critical to their health moving forward. So just to illuminate the power of these safe spaces, especially in the early weeks of a crisis, I wanted to share a video from our colleagues in Sudan who can show us a little bit about an e-learning center there.
We are now at Abna Shamal child-friendly safe learning space. The child-friendly space has 100 plus children every day. We have the integrated approach in Abna Shamal. We have hand washing facilities for the children before they enter the space. There's a health clinic to provide primary health care, and the safe learning space or the child-friendly space. تحبي تلعبي كتابات؟
أيوة.
تحبيها تلعبها؟
أنا بحب العربي والثاني بحب الإنجليزي.
ليه أكثر حاجة بتحبيها؟
كل ما ألعب كثير بتعلم كثير.
All the children come here every day to enjoy their time. There's psychosocial support and mental health. They do some drawing every day. They do some digital learning and some games. They're enjoying their games while they are learning. We're trying to support children here that have been displaced due to the conflict.
So I think that video is really powerful because it shows that even in a relatively humble setting, in this case, a large tent with mats on the floor and a handful of learning materials and tablets to learn from, UNICEF is still able to provide that multi-sectoral approach to providing education emergencies alongside these other essential services.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the very inclusive answer. And I think I would like to follow up. We've talked about all of these great services. I would like to also touch on the some of the challenges that young people face in accessing education in emergencies, and how does that inform UNICEF's approach? And I know that different conflict with different settings makes it very difficult, that there's no one program that could be applicable to all, right? Like the situation in Gaza where there are no schools, or like there are no buildings, they're not even a real setting for education. So how does these challenges look, and how they're addressed?
Yeah. Yeah, you're right that it's never as simple as just one answer, but there are some common challenges that we see young people facing as they're accessing education in different emergency settings. We've already talked a little bit about some of the hardship that each child has often experienced in these settings. So the baseline challenge is managing some of those psychosocial elements. How does a young person maintain motivation and find comfort in new education spaces? How can they feel fully engaged in learning opportunities when they're also experiencing some of these other emotional and very challenging experiences? So, again, establishing those safe spaces, providing those mental health services, that's a really important key first step. But there are other barriers. And being able to just access schools and educational facilities that are available still within a conflict setting is hard enough. I'll share an example of a 14-year-old named Abara from Yemen who was displaced from his home and has been living in the Al Suwaidi camp in Marib with his family since 2020. So, as context for those who aren't familiar, we're now 9 years into the conflict in Yemen, and children's learning struggles have persisted. Abra is just one of 9.8 million children who are in need of humanitarian support in Yemen. He himself is supporting his family by selling mineral water to pedestrians and car drivers because his father and two of his siblings have disabilities. But despite that, Abra still goes to school every day. And to do that, he walks half an hour each way while carrying his 13-year-old sister, Ibtikar, on his back, who has a disability and isn't able to access a wheelchair or other accessible supports. This is pretty incredible, and it's absolutely, they deserve the dignity and accessibility to not have to make this trek every day. But the fact that they both persevere to be able to access this learning and that their learning is made possible thanks to a UNICEF-led learning space, I think is a really powerful example. And so there are lots of layers just in that one case of why accessibility is so challenging. The financial constraints, just the presence of disabilities in the family, that all complicates things. Beyond that, there are some other challenges. There are some children who are just not able to access physical learning spaces at all, either because it's unsafe or they don't have the means to do so. In those cases, UNICEF also can leverage other tools, like mobile phones, for example, to be able to continue learning. So, for example, mobile phones can be used to provide content directly through SMS or apps. We can provide text and call-based tutoring to continue that learning. We can support teacher trainings to be able to continue offering support in communities. And we can also send nudges to remind parents who might be sort of trying to foster the children's learning when they're not able to go to school. Two examples of that in Bangladesh, where there are more than 477,000 school-age Rohingya refugees from Myanmar who live in refugee camps in the country. UNICEF worked with partners to provide caregivers with both paper-based resources and radio content also through their phones. And so that's a way for them to provide learning to their children in their home. Similarly, in Burkina Faso, where education can be disrupted due to internal armed conflicts, UNICEF has supported radio-based listening clubs. So, small groups of 5 to 10 children come together with a facilitator to listen and complete some of their exercises together. So again, it's not a comprehensive replacement, but it is an important sort of stopgap. And then maybe to speak a little bit more to some of the challenges for children who've been displaced. I think some of what I've described can be true for children who've experienced displacement or for those who are, still in their homes but are in a conflict setting. For displaced children, though, there are a number of other challenges. One of them is related to language. If a child has been displaced across borders, they may be in a community where they don't share the same language or same culture, and that can make it really difficult to access the available formal learning that's in that country. So one of UNICEF's strategies, and this has certainly been true in the Ukraine response, is to really identify teachers and facilitators who can support learning in a child's native language, but then also encourage them to sort of supplement that by beginning to learn the language of their host community. This helps them acclimate and build connections with their peers, which we know is really important for child development. And then similarly, when children are displaced, they're not often coming with their paperwork, with school records. And so it can be difficult to know the skills that they have, what level of learning is appropriate for them. And this is already a challenge, with all of the disruptions caused by COVID. So when we layer on armed conflict on top of that, there are some children who are many years behind where they're expected to be for their age. So in adapting to that, UNICEF has to offer, catch-up learning programs for children who might be well behind their grade level and make sure that they're able to build the skills that are appropriate for their age. And this can be especially helpful as crises become more protracted, and there may be more opportunities to integrate into formal education systems. And so I just want to briefly pivot to a video from our colleagues at UNICEF Jordan, who have run a reading recovery program as a great example of this.
أنا كنت قبل تعافي القراءة كنت زعلانة إني يعني ما بقدر أقرأ وأكتب يعني بعمري بصفي. مهم إنه البنت تطلع يعني متعلمة وتعرف تقرأ وتكتب لأنها هي جزء كثير فعال بالمجتمع.
ظهر التفوق والتقدم منذ البداية. وجدت أن الطالب تستطيع أن تقرأ بطلاقة. أجمل ما برنامج التعافي أنه تناول مستويات رائعة جدا. تخصيص القراءة فقط تختلف عن مبحث اللغة العربية اللي مشمول بالقواعد والنحو والتعبير. مهارات اللغة العربية شاملة.
بعد تعافي القراءة صرت أعرف أكتب وأقرأ وكثير أشياء حلوة. حسيت تعافي القراءة إنه تعزز ثقتي بنفسي وصرت أعمل إنجازات.
Yeah, so I think, these are just a few examples of some of these challenges that young people face in accessing education during conflicts. And I think what I take away from it is, despite the daunting circumstances, how committed young people are to continuing their education in these settings.
Andrew, these are tremendous effort by the UNICEF in those places with conflict and crisis. As you mentioned, for example, in Yemen, this protracted conflict that's been happening for years now. So how does UNICEF adapt its approach to education when emergencies become protracted over many months or even years?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing more and more examples of these protracted crises. The threat of significant learning losses definitely increases as these crises extend, because children are less likely to access these formal educational opportunities that they need for their age and their abilities. And so, often that's a space where UNICEF can advocate to make sure that there are spaces for refugee children in particular to access national education systems, or at least to establish, parallel equivalent systems in refugee camps that are appropriate for them and that are, again, tailored to their language, their age, and, the systems they're familiar with. At the same time, though, UNICEF needs to approach the context very intentionally. There's a recognition that when providing services to refugees from a host community, national government, that can often tax public systems of the host communities themselves. And what we never want to do is perpetuate any tensions between refugee communities and host communities. And so one thing UNICEF is intentional about is when it's designing services for refugee children, it's also intentionally offering those same services, usually to vulnerable families from host communities. So I'll give an example from Jordan, which I think is a great example. As many folks know, Jordan has been hosting hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees since the onset of the war in 2011. And while there are 2 large refugee camps that are formalized in Jordan, the majority of refugees actually live outside of the formal camps in more urban settings. And so the sustained presence of a larger refugee population has required that the Jordanian education system adapt and make meaningful changes. So the system evolved to something called a double shift approach, where the school day is essentially split in half, with half of the students attending in the mornings and half attending in the afternoons. This introduced a new challenge because as both Jordanian and Syrian children were left without this sort of safe outlet of school for many more hours a day. And so there was a question of, how can we continue to support them as the education system has adjusted? So one of the strategies that UNICEF and the government has taken is to keep children engaged, and to really promote their deeper learning through a network of what are called Makani centers. So these centers were initially operated as a safe learning space for refugees, but they soon evolved to become a learning space for children of all identities to attend when they're not in school. It's a highly flexible approach, and I was fortunate to get to go to Jordan and see these in person last year. And so it can include everything from a single trailer in a more rural or nomadic community that is offering skills development classes or a space for play, to a much more robust, large permanent complex in the heart of the city in Amman, for instance, where children can access a computer lab, sports and arts facilities, a music room, and also access, importantly, catch-up learning and learning support services that complement well the formal education system. So, that's just one specific example of how UNICEF is adapting its approach in a more protracted crisis.
Thank you for providing this context, Andrew. I think that brings us to a very important point that I want us to touch on is what can be done to anticipate shocks to the education system and limit disruptions to children's learning. And especially, I know how difficult it is to kind of like maintain or to look at it from this perspective, just because coming from personal experience that during the conflict and the continuous war in Iraq, how these schools were used as, places to store ammunition and like do military activities. But how can that be mitigated or limited to the disruption of the learning?
Yeah, I mean, of course, so much of UNICEF's work in this space is responding in real time to the acute needs that children have. But, it would be a disservice to children to not think about what can we do in advance? How can we anticipate, especially in more fragile settings that might be more prone to crises and to conflicts? How can we make sure that the system is stronger and anticipating this? So first, I'll just say that, this is on this issue. Governments are duty bearers of child rights, and they have to play a strong role in protecting those rights. This is exactly why UNICEF's #1 partner in every country we operate with is the national government, because we need their partnership to be able to sustain the positive impacts and protect the rights of children. So just, in a legal context, we know that during armed conflict, that schools and the right to education are protected. They should be protected. The Safe Schools Declaration really details this requirement to protect educational facilities during conflict and really reaffirms the right to education for all children. 120 countries have signed onto that declaration, and it can be a really key tool, I think, in sort of the political and governmental arena to protect education during conflict. But, more practically for governments and communities, there are ways to, effectively prepare education systems before any of these crises and shocks might hit the system. It's why UNICEF spends so much time investing in system strengthening efforts broadly. This could include, encouraging appropriate public investment in the education sector by governments, strengthening available evidence and data collection systems, and importantly, investing in the training and compensation of teachers. We know that teachers are an incredible resource, and particularly in humanitarian settings, teachers are overstretched. They are suffering from their own traumas. They're often going without payment. And they're also asked to serve a multitude of roles, really, beyond just supporting a student's learning. In 2023, UNICEF worked to ensure that the teachers were equipped with the necessary skills to better support learning continuity and the mental health of students. In Haiti, for example, UNICEF supported the Ministry of Education with cash transfers for 2,500 teachers, which enabled them to first offer catch-up sessions for children in their communities. But because they were able to have this, financial stability through the cash transfer program, we were able to sort of strengthen the overall resilience of the education system. And it's just worth emphasizing that, teachers are so critical to invest in because they play a key role in addressing the impacts of conflict on children. They can play a role when trained properly to foster social cohesion and well-being. We've seen that in the Democratic Republic of Congo. UNICEF equipped more than 1,700 teachers with the skills to foster a sense of social cohesion among children who were affected by conflict. And doing that not only helps them in the immediate term, but can also help in the long term as we encourage children to, foster a more peaceful future for them and their communities.
And Andrew, I will add to all of the previous information that as the conflict continued in Iraq, the UNICEF has launched a multi-million-dollar project to ensure that all children receive basic educational supplies. And that's when the UNICEF started to distribute more than 6 million school bags and education kits to children throughout the country. And I was one of the lucky one who received that kit. And it was my first new book bag that I've carried. And at that time I was in high school. But that was the highlight for me as well. One of these services that I personally, as a displaced child who lived during conflict, was able to receive and cherish at that time. So thank
I
you
love
for
that.
recapping on all of the services, the amazing work that the organization is doing out there. And I think I would like to conclude with the question of what can individuals do to support children around the globe whose education has been interrupted due to conflict, and in many cases, not only once or twice, and especially during the time where conflict is protracted.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. And to really help answer that question, I'd love to share a message first from the president and CEO of UNICEF USA, Michael Nyenhuis.
Hello, my name is Michael Nyenhuis, and I am President and CEO of UNICEF USA. I want to share my appreciation to Guilford College for shining a light on this important issue through the Education Interrupted series. As we've outlined today, disruptions to a child's education due to conflict have immediate and long-lasting consequences to a child's learning, well-being, and healthy development. The conversation may leave you wondering, how can I help children facing these daunting circumstances? You've already taken an important first step. We need more people like you who have taken the time to learn about the topic and then to share those learnings with their families, friends, communities, and decision makers to sensitize them to the issues and, if they can, to help fund UNICEF's work. Support to UNICEF's Global Humanitarian Fund enables UNICEF to respond comprehensively to humanitarian crises, including providing continuing education and other essential services. The fund is particularly effective at channeling resources to overlooked emergencies, including many of those referenced today, like in Sudan, Myanmar, and Haiti. With your support, UNICEF can continue to relentlessly pursue a world where every child enjoys their right to education. Thank you.
So, as Michael said, UNICEF is working relentlessly to address the educational needs of millions of children around the globe, including so many living in humanitarian settings. Your support and your continuing education and engagement on this issue can help so many young people worldwide. So just really want to recognize Guilford College for planning this in the first place and shining the spotlight. And to anyone listening in, this is a really important first step.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today and providing such important insights into the dire situation from many places around the world, in particular, the impact on children and the future generations, but also covering the important work that the UNICEF is doing in many places around the world. I know that millions of children around the world appreciate this amount of work. I am one of those million of children who highly appreciate this work. We will continue to explore these pressing concerns in our upcoming episodes. Once again, I am Noor Ghazi, and this is Education Interrupted. We appreciate your time and dedication to this cause, and see you in the next episode. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.